7 Most Dangerous Prisoner in the World. Number 1. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer, rapist, and burglar in the mid-1980s. He was born on February 29, 1960, in Texas and grew up in a troubled household. His father was a former police officer who physically abused him, and his cousin Mike, who had served in the Vietnam War, shared stories with Ramirez of his brutal killings and mutilations of women. Ramirez started his criminal career at the age of 12 when he began using drugs and burglarizing homes. In the mid-1980s, he began a killing spree that lasted for over a year, during which he committed at least 13 murders and numerous rapes. The Night Stalker would enter his victims' homes at night, kill them with a variety of weapons, and often sexually assault or mutilate their bodies. He became infamous for leaving satanic symbols at the crime scenes, and his brutal and senseless crimes terrorized the residents of Los Angeles and San Francisco. Ramirez was finally caught in August 1985, when he was recognized by a group of residents in East Los Angeles, who chased and beat him until police arrived. He was charged with 13 counts of murder, as well as numerous other crimes, and was sentenced to death in 1989. Number 2. Albert Fish. Albert Fish was a notorious American serial killer, child rapist, and cannibal who was active during the early 20th century. He was born in 1870 and died in 1936, and is believed to have killed at least 3 children and possibly more. Albert Fish's disturbing and sadistic behavior earned him the nickname the Gray Man and the Werewolf of Wisteria. He was known to target young children, and would often lure them away from their homes or playgrounds with the promise of a job or a treat. He would then torture, mutilate, and kill them, sometimes even cannibalizing their remains. In addition to his murders, Albert Fish was also known for his disturbing letters to the families of his victims and to other individuals, in which he described in graphic detail his sadistic sexual fantasies and his cannibalistic tendencies. He was eventually caught, tried, and convicted for the murder of a 10-year-old girl named Grace Budd, whom he had lured away from her home in 1928. Albert Fish's case is widely regarded as one of the most gruesome and disturbing in the history of American crime. His behavior has been the subject of numerous books, articles, and documentaries, and his legacy continues to shock and horrify people to this day. Number 3. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was indeed a notorious serial killer and rapist who committed a series of heinous crimes in the United States in the 1970s. He was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, and was known as the Killer Clown because of his penchant for dressing up as a clown for children's parties and events. John Wayne Gacy's crimes were particularly brutal and shocking. Between 1972 and 1978, he sexually assaulted and murdered at least 33 young men and boys, many of whom he lured to his home under the pretense of offering them work or a place to stay. Gacy would then strangle or suffocate his victims and dispose of their bodies in the crawl space beneath his house. John Wayne Gacy's crimes went undetected for years, but he eventually came under suspicion and was arrested in December 1978. He was found guilty of 33 murders and sentenced to death. Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994, at the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. John Wayne Gacy's crimes remain a source of horror and fascination for many people, and his case has been the subject of numerous books, films, and other forms of media. Number 4. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer was a notorious American serial killer and cannibal who was active from 1978 to 1991. He was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in 1960, and grew up in a relatively normal middle-class family. However, Dahmer began exhibiting disturbing behavior from an early age, including an obsession with animal mutilation. In 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder when he picked up a hitchhiker and took him back to his parents' house, where he killed and dismembered him. Over the next 13 years, he went on to kill a total of 17 young men and boys, most of whom were of African or Asian descent. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes were particularly gruesome and involved rape, dismemberment, necrophilia, and cannibalism. He would often keep body parts as trophies or use them in sexual acts. He was eventually caught in 1991 when one of his intended victims managed to escape and flagged down a police car. When police searched Dahmer's apartment, they found evidence of his crimes, including human remains in his refrigerator and freezer. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested and charged with 17 counts of murder. He initially pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but later changed his plea to guilty in exchange for a life sentence. He was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he was murdered by a fellow inmate in 1994. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes shocked the world and his name has become synonymous with the worst kind of serial killer. His story has been the subject of numerous books, films, and documentaries, and has been studied by criminologists and psychologists in an effort to better understand the mindset of serial killers. Number 5. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, is a convicted American serial killer who was responsible for the murders of at least 49 women in the state of Washington in the 1980s and 1990s. His first known victim was killed in 1982, and he continued to kill over the next 2 decades. Gary Ridgway was known for targeting sex workers and young women, many of whom he picked up along Pacific Highway South, an area in Seattle that was known for prostitution. He would strangle his victims and dump their bodies in remote locations, often near the Green River in King County, which is how he earned his infamous nickname. After an extensive investigation, Ridgway was arrested in 2001 and later pleaded guilty to 48 counts of first-degree murder in a plea bargain deal. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gary Ridgway is considered one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Number 6. Thomas Edward Silverstein. Thomas Edward Silverstein was an American convict who was serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for multiple counts of murder and armed robbery. He was widely considered one of the most violent and dangerous inmates in the federal prison system. Thomas Edward Silverstein grew up in Long Beach, California, and became involved in criminal activity at a young age. He was first incarcerated at the age of 19 for armed robbery, and during his time in prison, he became involved with white supremacist groups. In 1983, Thomas Edward Silverstein was transferred to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX, in Florence, Colorado, which is also known as the Supermax Prison. He was placed in solitary confinement, and he remained there for the rest of his life. Despite being held in isolation, Silverstein was involved in several high-profile incidents, including 3 murders of fellow inmates and multiple assaults on prison staff. Thomas Edward Silverstein's life and crimes have been the subject of several books and documentaries. His story is often cited as an example of the extreme violence and brutality that can be found in the U.S. prison system, as well as the devastating psychological effects of long-term solitary confinement. Number 7. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei Chikatilo was a notorious Soviet serial killer who was active between 1978 and 1990. He was known as the Butcher of Rostov or the Red Ripper due to the brutal nature of his crimes, which included the rape, mutilation, and murder of at least 52 women and children. Andrei Chikatilo was born in the Ukraine and grew up during the Soviet era. He had a difficult childhood, marked by poverty and the trauma of World War II. He was also subjected to bullying and ridicule by his peers, which is believed to have contributed to his later violent tendencies. Andrei Chikatilo began his killing spree in 1978 and continued until his arrest in 1990. He preyed on vulnerable individuals, particularly young women and children, often luring them to secluded locations under false pretenses before attacking them. He would then mutilate their bodies, often removing organs or biting off body parts. Andrei Chikatilo's crimes went undetected for many years, and he was able to continue his killing spree for over a decade before being caught. However, he was eventually identified as a suspect and arrested in 1990. He was later convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death in 1992. Andrei Chikatilo's case remains one of the most infamous serial killer cases in history, and has been the subject of numerous books, films, and documentaries. It has also had a significant impact on the field of criminal psychology, particularly in terms of the study of sexual sadism and other forms of extreme violence.